Welcome to this brief screencast on meteor-example-form. I want to walk through the system for you. When it runs, it comes up with a page that looks like this, and if you submit it, you can see that it tags the required fields as being required. So let me put some stuff in here. I am a professor, and I like to paddle, and I'm really not any of these, but it's required, so I'll make myself a senior. Of course, I have a great grade point, and then my major is computer science. And so if I submit all that, the data is added to a collection. It's assigned this doc ID, and I provide a link to be able to go and retrieve that information. So this is a second page called Edit Student Data, and it fills out the each of the controls, HTML controls, with the saved data. And if I want to do something like change a field, I can do update. It's updated, and you can kind of see that by refreshing the page that my GPA is dropped. So that's basically all that this application does. Is it shows how you can lay out a form. We'll go back to here. And this is using the semantic UI form controls, and it's hooked up, and then when you press submit, it hooks it up to the Meteor template processing machinery, saves it in a collection, and then we can get it back. Okay. So the fundamental components are Meteor, Blaze, the templating, and semantic UI. To install it, you do the standard kind of thing. To run it, you run it with an npm script. And you can also, there's ESLint included with it to make sure the code is okay. Before doing anything else, you want to know a little bit about Meteor in general, and then there's Meteor Application Template, which is an application that provides my conventions for directory layout, naming, routing, etc., which are basically just the Meteor 1.4 practices, so there's nothing real surprising. I just showed you all these screenshots in the running version of the system. So let's look at the code. I'll just kind of go through it. This page, the student data, you can see that everything's basically stored as either a string or a list of strings to keep things kind of simple. And we have a publications that just publishes all of the data, and we subscribe to all of the data because publications and subscriptions are not the point of understanding how to do form processing, so we make it simple. The part of this that's really the most important part of this entire application is in the import UI components form controls directory. And here you can see that I've created a set of HTML and JS files to encapsulate the semantic UI, CSS, and the associated HTML form control in a Meteor template. So let's see how that might work. The text form control is kind of an easy one to start with. Actually, I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to do it in IntelliJ, so you get better syntax highlighting. So if we go to text form control, okay. So what you can see is we have a template called text form control, and I show you in the comments an example of what the resulting HTML would look like after you instantiate one of these form controls. This is a div, and there's a mixture of Blaze, templating stuff, and basically we check to see if the field should be required or not by passing in a required parameter. The label is supplied as a parameter. The name is the name field of the input control defaults to the label, but you can also pass the name itself, and then that will be included. Similarly for ID, that defaults to label, or you can pass it in explicitly. Similarly for the placeholder, it defaults to label, but you can pass it in explicitly, and then if you have a value, it'll be set there. And then there's this other template template called form error message, which is used to display error messages associated with this control if there are any. So let's just look and see how that form control is actually invoked. To do that, let's go to the Create Student Data page, and you can see here's an invocation of the text form control. We're just going to pass in the label. Since we don't pass in the name, the ID, or the placeholder, that's going to be, those fields will be defaulted to this value. We're also specifying that this field is required. And then we have this error message that is going to be either nothing if the call to the helper function, field error, being passed name, returns nothing, or else it'll return the actual error message. Okay, let's take a look at this template. This template basically says if error message is non-empty, or truthy, I guess you should say, then this template will expand into a div that has this UI error message. And if you look at semantic UI, this is the kind of the way that it wants to see error message. It does the appropriate kind of styling for an error message. And then the contents of the div is the actual error message itself. So that's how the text form control works. Text area form control is very similar, almost identical. You just have a rows attribute and you use text area rather than input type equals text. Pretty much everything else is just the same. Those are the two easy ones. Then it starts to get a tiny bit more complicated. If we look at checkboxes, what we do there is we have an outer template which establishes the fact that we're going to have these a label, and then we're going to have interior fields, and then for each of the objects that are passed in this checkboxes parameter, we're going to loop through them and invoke this sub-template called checkbox field. Checkbox fields looks like this. This is a field, it's a UI checkbox, and then we again do this kind of defaulting stuff to prevent us from having to actually explicitly pass all these things all the time. Okay, and then you can see in the associated JavaScript with this is where we do the infamous invocation of the jQuery and JavaScript for semantic UI to make checkboxes look nice the way semantic UI wants them to look. So that's how checkboxes look. Radios, which are basically checkboxes where only one of them can be selected at a time, and they look like circles rather than squares. Almost exactly the same idea, but we're going to pass in radio level data, and we have a radio field rather than a checkbox field. And the big difference there is essentially that you say, instead of saying UI checkbox, you say UI radio checkbox. But otherwise, I think it's pretty much identical. And again, we have the semantic UI invocation of the JavaScript to enable that radio idea. What else? Then the final one is selection. So let's just go back to here. So we've looked at the text, we've looked at text area, we've looked at checkboxes, we've looked at levels. We've got two more. One is the GPA and the majors. This is a single selection. Majors is a multiple selection. So let's go look at those. And those are actually both implemented via the same form controller template called select form control. And if you want a multiple one, you just pass in multiple equals true, because the real only difference between the two is this little piece of HTML here where we specify whether it's multiple or not. And again, we have this idea of an interior template. I'm sorry, we don't have an interior template. We just have an interior loop where we pass in an object which is a list of objects called options, and then we iterate through and we fill out the value of the HTML there. When it's all done, it's going to look something like that. Okay, so, and if you want to see how that looks when it's invoked, you can see here's for the single selection the GPA, and if you want to do multiple selection, this is what this one looks like. You can see multiple equals true. Okay, but really the important part of this is the helper functions, hobbies, levels, GPAs, and majors, which are actually providing the data that's necessary to implement these things. And for that, you have to go look at the JS here. So you can see this is what hobbies looks like, this is what levels looks like, this is what GPAs looks like. And basically, each of these things are relying on a data structure that I've defined up here. Okay, and the reason why I define it up here is because I need to export it, because it turns out that the edit student data page needs to use those same data structures, right? You know, where the edit student data page is very, very similar in form to the create student data page. In fact, with a little bit more refactoring, I probably could have just made it a single page, but I just decided at some point that that would be pedagogically maybe more confusing than edifying. So this template looks almost the same. It does have to check to make sure whether the subscriptions are ready before it outputs the div, because in the case of the edit student data page, we actually have to retrieve a student document in order to pre-fill these forms with the data associated with that student. And so we have to do the standard Meteor trick of checking to make sure that our subscription to the student collection is done before we actually try to emit this stuff. So going back to student, so that's how the helper functions work. Now the last thing that's kind of interesting about this application is you can see that if we submit and with nothing, we get stuff displayed. We get these error fields displayed, and in fact, if we then, you know, go do the stuff we're supposed to do, then we get a success message sent out at the bottom of the screen. So there's really three states. This is the success state where we've just submitted something, and so we have this div displayed at the bottom of the screen. Then we have the kind of default state, which is where we haven't done anything yet, so we don't have a success message at the bottom of the screen, and we also don't have any errors. And then the third state is the error state, where we want to submit, or we want to display these error fields. So there's three states. The default state, there's no green, no red. The error state, there's some red, and the success state, which is there's some green. Okay, so that's the motivation behind having the reactive dictionary, where we basically set some booleans to be true or false depending upon whether or not we don't want to display any success or error messages, or whether we want to display just the success message or just the error message. Okay, and so we do that with these two Boolean flags that we set to both be false when the page is created. That means no red, no green will be displayed. And then after we get data, if we find the data is valid, then we're going to display the success. We're going to set the success message. It's not a Boolean, I'm sorry, it's a value to be the ID, but that's a truthy value. And we'll set the error messages to false. However, if we find it's not valid, then we go into this else clause where we set the display message to false so we don't see the green thing, but we just set the display error messages to true so we do see error messages. And what that effectively does is, in the case of errors, make that template, that helper will expand to error. And the way that does that is by looking at this helper right here, where it says error class returns if display error message has a truthy value, then this helper will expand into the string error, otherwise expands into nothing. Similarly, in the event of success, we have this expand into the string success, or else nothing. Okay, and then if we do have errors, okay, this is a little bit of complicated code, but basically what happens is to determine whether or not we have errors, we are going to first of all get all of the data out of our event object, and this is kind of the canonical way to get data out of event objects. And you can see here's how you get it for text field, here's how you get it for a text area, here's how you get it for checkboxes, Here's how you get it for radio buttons. Here's how you get it for a selection. Here's how you get it for multiple selections. So these are examples of how you pull information out of the event target for all of the common form controls. And what I do after that is I create an object containing all that data, and I do the simple schema validation trick, which you can read about a simple schema, but you can see an example of it here. First we reset validation to get rid of any old stuff, and then we clean it. That's because when you actually do an insert, simple schema calls clean anyway, so we better provide the same information to our validate method that will be later passed to the insert method. And so we call this validate, and that will enable this isValid method to be true or false depending upon whether or not this new student data, which is this stuff, satisfies the schema. And if we look here, here's our schema, which says that, you know, name must be a string and it's required, bio must be a string, but it's optional. Hobbies has to be a list of strings. Level has to be a string and it's required. GPA has to be a string and it's required. And then majors is a list of strings and it's optional. Okay? So going back to here, basically in the case of a creation event, we're going to use insert. We're not using meteor methods. We should be using meteor methods. But so here, if we were using meteor methods, we'd call our method at this point. But I have insecure on because the purpose of this application is to illustrate form processing, and I wanted to reduce the other amount of code as much as possible. In the case of editing, it's almost exactly the same, except if everything is valid, we're going to call the update method, and we're going to update. We find the doc ID of the student whose data we want to update by looking at the URL. Okay, so if you maybe didn't notice this before, but if we go, I don't know, yeah, so we go back here, here's some data that we're editing. You can see that the doc ID is actually in the URL. There's a lot of different ways, you know, you could use session variables, there's a lot of different techniques you could use to find the doc ID of a current user. And in this application, what I'm using is the URL. So you can see if we go to startup, client, router, you can see this :ID here, which is how we store the ID and retrieve the ID when we need it. Okay, that's pretty much, if I'm not mistaken, that might be a good overview of the system. Let me get back to my overview page and make sure I've done everything. There's this stuff. Form controller templates, we've gone over that. We've shown how to create student data. We've looked at the JavaScript, the onCreated, the events callback. Editing, pretty much just like creation, except we're going to retrieve the data and pre-populate the form. That actually is probably worth talking about. When you look at the create student data page, you see all these event handlers like hobbies, levels, GPAs, and majors. Okay, these are pretty simple because we're just basically need the structure of the form, like what are the hobbies. Okay, however, when you look at those very same helpers, in the case of the edit student data, what you can see is, oh, they're more complicated. Okay, and that's because now in this case we need to return a hobbies list that actually indicates which hobbies were selected by that user, because this is the edit page. And so what we have to do is first retrieve the student data. That means getting the doc ID out of the URL and then passing it to find one. So we've got this document, student data, and then we have to find the selected hobbies. And here's this case where you have this weird code that's very Meteor specific. Okay, we've just called this, and you might think, you know, well, that's going to find the student data, so why do I need this kind of guard to say selected hobbies is either, you know, that student data has to exist before I actually try to invoke the field accessor on it. And the reason is because of the way subscriptions work, it's possible that this hobbies helper could run before the subscription has fully populated the client-side Mongo database, in which case this find one might not succeed, and you have these problems. Now these problems only actually show up temporarily. It's kind of a transitory phenomena that you only see if you have Chrome Developers Tools open. The page, you might see a little bit of flickering, but or not even, so you won't notice it as a user. But I find it extremely irritating to see error messages in the console window that are just kind of an artifact of the way Meteor processes, does the subscription processing. And so I use this kind of guard technique, which you can read more about at this URL right here, to prevent the console window from having these kind of gratuitous error messages, or superfluous or something wrong error messages. Okay, but anyway, hobbies. You have to find the selected hobbies. Levels, we have to find out what level the student was at, so that we can actually put this checked value into the appropriate level. Same with GPAs. We got to make sure selected is true when it's when it's the GPA the student had indicated previously. Similarly for majors, we have to find all the majors they had and make those selected as well. So these are a little more complicated, and that will hopefully help you see how, when you're trying to populate a form with data from a document, this is the way you can do it for all the common controllers. Okay, so there's that, and I think at that point we're pretty good. Again, the caveat is this is my best understanding of how to do form processing from Meteor 1.4 with Semantic UI. If you have a better idea, please let me know, and I will update this code to reflect it. Thanks a lot.